Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist-Third Worldist Collective. In this podcast, I wanted to present a respectful critique of superstition. Now, I realize that might sound odd, and it sounds odd to me, to be honest, but I think it is important, especially when dealing with people different from ourselves. Now, that could be people in the first world, that could be people in the third world, that could be people in the fourth world. Doesn't matter. There are always people who believe in superstition. I used to believe in superstition. Years ago, when I was a kid, I was a devotee of astrology, of numerology, of psychometry, of telekinesis, and of seances. I used to actually hold these seances in the kitchen with my parents and my sister, and and supposedly I had this contact in the world to come who called herself Queen Elizabeth. That's what she called herself. We made up this homemade Ouija board, meaning we had like pieces of paper with letters and numbers on them that we put around in a circle. And we used an upside, I guess, wine glass. I don't drink, so I don't know much about the different types of alcoholic beverage glasses, but I guess it was a wine glass or a cocktail glass. And and we all put two fingers from each hand on the wine glass turned upside down, and we would ask questions. And magically, it would appear as though the wine glass would move by itself. Well, of course, it was not moving by itself. Of course, we were the ones who were moving it. I know that now. Back then, I didn't know that. And we would ask Queen Elizabeth every question imaginable. It was really, really odd. Then, after I would finish that, I would try to do a psychic reading on people. In fact, I once went to a psychic fair where I did psychic readings on people in the psychic fair, and I charged money for it. Now, I didn't want to charge money. I said, no, I want to do it for free. But they said, well, if you're here, you have to charge money. So I agreed reluctantly to charge money. I didn't charge that much. I think like $2. And and people would tell me, "Oh, how marvelous! Everything you said was correct." That shows how cognitive consonance works. We will see things in our environment and we will try to fit those things, no matter how absurd, no matter how incongruous, with our pre existing thoughts. So I would do that. I also tried to bend spoons like Uri Geller. Never had much luck with that. But I would also take objects. I believe this was called psychometry. And I would hold the object for an extended period of time and try to determine what the history of the object was. Now, the good thing about that technique is there is no way of proving me wrong, right? I could be wrong, I could be right, but how do I know, right? In other words, I don't know the history of that object, but I assumed that I was correct. Now, bear in mind, when I did this, I was between the ages of 11 and 14. So I hope you will forgive me for that. I realized it was silly, and I did it. The reason I'm mentioning this is to point out that superstition is a global phenomenon. We look at the QAnon movement right now, which is a pro Donald Trump movement. I'm not even sure if QAnon exists anymore, but maybe it does in some form. Where this guy named Q or woman named Q, I'm not sure what gender the person is, would claim to make predictions about what would happen to Donald Trump. Now, I admit I did not follow QAnon that closely, so I might be messing some of this stuff up. But it struck me as being enormously weird until I would remember my own life and realize, well, yeah, I did things like that too. Now, they weren't right wing like QAnon, but I still indulged myself in these weird, absurd superstitions. Why? I don't know. I guess I had nothing better to do. But honestly, I really enjoyed it. I got also into astrology, into numerology, and especially palmistry. I got really good at palmistry, whatever good at palmistry means. I'm not sure if one can be good at nonsense, but I was able to read people's hands. I knew what each of the lines stood for. I have forgotten most of them. I remember the lifeline, but the other ones I've mostly forgotten. And I remember the big thing that I would do, which in retrospect I think was kind of disrespectful, is I would predict how long people would live, you know? Now, most of those people I never saw again. So I have no idea if my predictions turned out to be correct. Honestly, I hope they did not. But I also read the palms of people in my family. In addition, if that wasn't enough, I got into Reiki and Jo-Ray, which are both forms of, I guess you could call them laying on of hands healing. Although at least in Jo-Ray, you don't actually touch the person. Now, I think the reason for that is to avoid federal charges so that you can't be accused of practicing massage therapy without a license. I don't know. That might be mistaken. But I would do it. I mean, and supposedly people who are really into this stuff would say, well, I do Reiki and I do Jo-Ray and I do therapeutic touch, and there are loads of them in that same general category, and they are each different forms of energy, and I can experience them. Now, do I think that they are each different forms of energy anymore? No, I think they were entirely making this stuff up in their heads. I think it was entirely fiction. Entirely fiction. But I believed it too. So I can't condemn them. I was among them. I did it. I became a Reiki master, which is the highest level you can get in Reiki. I became a Jo-Ray practitioner. There are no levels. You're either a Jo-Ray practitioner or you're not a Jo-Ray practitioner. Both of them originated in Japan, although to the best of my knowledge, they have no historical relationship with one another. So I was into a lot of superstition when I was growing up. And the Jo-Ray and Reiki were actually later. I think I was a college student when I did Jo-Ray and Reiki. Why? Don't ask me. I have no idea. In retrospect, I think I was definitely deluded, because I really believed that I was healing people, and I thought I had a special gift for healing animals, especially cats and dogs. And I know that when I put my hand on a cat and a dog, that those beings would relax. And I attributed that to my healing abilities. But in retrospect, anybody can put their hand on a cat or a dog and the animal will relax. They like human contact, or most of them do. Maybe some don't. So I'm mentioning this so I don't exclude myself from superstition. I was immersed in superstition. I even started my own religion when I was 11 years old. It was called An Introduction to Soulology, the scientific religion of the soul. I still have that book as a PDF. I have it uploaded. If you search for it, you may find it, but I hope you don't. And in soulology, my basic idea was there are two dimensions. There is a schizophrenic dimension where most people are schizophrenic, and there is a non-schizophrenic dimension where most people are not schizophrenic. But in the schizophrenic dimension, people who were schizophrenic compared to people who were not schizophrenic were an interesting relationship, because if you were schizophrenic, then the people who were not schizophrenic were not schizophrenic. That didn't make any sense, did it? In other words, there was one dimension where most people were schizophrenic and some people were not. There was a non-schizophrenic dimension where most people were not schizophrenic, but some people were. That's clear. It was a long book, and I would write that book in school. I remember sitting in class when I was supposed to be listening to my teacher, but instead I was writing my soulology book. Complete and total nonsense. And I explained in one place telepathy as what happens when one's own soul leaks into another soul. Leaks! And I'm not talking about taking a leak. I'm talking about the soul leaking into another soul. That was my explanation for how telepathy worked. I was also into astral projection. I loved astral projection. I was never good at it. To the best of my recollection, I was never successful at it either. From that, I got into Eckankar, which is kind of related to astral projection, except it is a branch of something called Surat Shabd Yoga, which was started in the mid 19th century by a guy named Shiv Dayal, whose followers called Swamiji. And I would recite silently in my head these 5 mantras. According to some schools of Surat Shabd Yoga, the mantras are secret. Those are the branches that are descended from Kripal Singh. But according to most branches of Surat Shabd Yoga, they are not secret. Here were the mantras, and I hope I remember them all. Jat Niranjan, Onkar, Rarankar, Soham, Sat Nam. Now you say those silently, and supposedly when you say them, your spiritual development increases. That means that you hear sounds of a higher frequency. The highest frequency, I think, is supposedly a harp. And you also see colors and shapes and forms of increasing brightness. The most bright, I believe, was violet. And I genuinely believed, and I'm not lying, I started this when I was 11 or 12, and I kept on doing it until I was a college student. So I can't claim childhood ignorance. I can only claim ignorance because I was ignorant. There's no getting around it. It was silly. Yeah, it was silly. I'm making light of it because I think it should be made light of. And I'm doing this for a reason, and that reason will become clear in just a moment. I did all these things because I wanted to connect with higher worlds, maybe like Emanuel Swedenborg. I wanted to connect with higher worlds. And that was the objective of Sorachabd Yoga. Interestingly, the founder of Eckankar, Paul Twitchell, denied that Eckankar was a faction of Sorachabd Yoga until a photograph leaked out with him standing next to Kirpal Singh, the founder of Rohani Satsang, one of the branches of Sorachabd Yoga. And then Paul Twitchell could deny it no longer. Some Eckists, as they're called, and the movement is still very much alive, left Eckankar at that point. And I respect them for doing that. Some stayed. And Paul Twitchell was succeeded, if I remember correctly, by Darwin Gross. Eventually, for some reason that I don't understand, Darwin Gross was kicked out. How can you kick a perfect master out? Somebody who was supposedly perfect. I guess he became imperfect. Regardless, Darwin Gross was kicked out and was replaced by this other guy named Harold Klemp. Harold Klemp may be the current quote unquote Eck master, but I'm not sure because I really haven't followed it much since then. Okay, so the idea is to show that psychicism, occultism, esotericism, the paranormal are not unique to any one part of the world. They are very, very widespread in the US. That spread started in the 1970s primarily, and it has simply accelerated since then. So, when we are dealing with people in the third world, which is really the point of this podcast, and we run into people who believe in things that we may, with our brains, think is nonsense. Think of me. Think of me. And that I am not from the third world. I may be weird. I may be autistic, which is almost the same as being weird. But a lot of people who are not autistic are also into these kinds of things. So it's not limited to autistics. So if you run into people who follow voodoo or any one of a number of different practices that you might look at and say, how can those people believe in such superstition. Remember that it's not just them, it's also us. By us, I mean the first world, like me. Superstition knows no boundaries. The antidote to superstition is science, including scientific socialism. By following scientific socialism, by understanding the dialectic, by trying as best we can to promote communism through conscientization, critical conscience, and consciousness raising. That is the way that we can combat superstition. Because we are actually engaging in activities which countervene superstition, which contradict superstition. And we should do that, in my humble opinion. But when we do that, again, my strong suggestion, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, is that we do it respectfully, not judgmentally. We should not judge other people. I am always careful not to do that. And for me, it's easy because I was once in that category. So for me, it's easy not to judge people since I once did the same kinds of things or similar kinds of things. I mean, anybody who holds seances and thinks that they are in communion using an artificial Ouija board with Queen Elizabeth, and I have no idea which Queen Elizabeth, is obviously out of their minds. Well, slight exaggeration. Is obviously superstitious. So my suggestion is to prepare oneself to learn about the people that you are going to practice conscientization with, to familiarize yourself with their customs and their practices, so that when you approach them, you are approaching them from a position of knowledge, not a position of ignorance. Because I can tell you from personal experience, having met many third world and fourth world, like indigenous peoples, that many of them are extremely sensitive to when people like me or other first worlders look down upon them. They do not like being looked down upon. Well, who would? Who would? But especially if you are in the third world or the fourth world and you are talking to somebody from the first world, and that person is, whether vocally or under that person's breath, laughing at you. That person can tell. Take my word for it. That person can tell. You may not think so. You may think you are hiding it. From personal experience, once again, I can tell you, no, you are not. No, you are not hiding it. Those people will pick up on it. So, conscientization directed at the third world needs to be done with a great deal of sensitivity to realize that we in the West have a lot of superstitions of our own. Again, remember me. And I'm not alone. Remember me. Always remember me. Or maybe you prefer to forget me. That's okay too. Because I was into those same kinds of things, or maybe not same, but similar kinds of things. And I can tell you that those kinds of practices are very, very, I was going to say addictive, but addictive is the wrong word. It's an overused term. It's very habitual. It's very magnetic. It's easy to get attached to these kinds of practices. And so I would strongly suggest that you become acquainted with the people you are studying, especially what you might, from your own heart, think of as superstition. Now, you may think you're doing them a favor by pointing out that what they believe is superstition. You are not. That is not the right way to engage in conscientization. I know that's a bit bold for me to say, but so what? That is not the right way to engage in conscientization. You do not put people down. You elevate people. The heart of conscientization is raising people's hearts, raising people's minds, and raising people's sense of confidence so that they feel like they too are capable of conscientization. Become a model for other people. A good model, not a bad model. One that other people will desire to emulate. Now, I'm not saying that people in the third world or the fourth world should imitate me. Far from it. No one should imitate me. No one, no one, no one. And I really, really mean that. I am the last person anyone should try to imitate. And I'm not saying that out of any kind of humility. I'm saying that out of honesty, because I know who I am. I know the kinds of weird practices that I was involved in when I was younger. So why would I expect anyone to be like me? I don't. In fact, I hope they're not. I hope that they can transcend where they are now, much as I hope that I can transcend where I am now, but not that they will look at me as some kind of ethical exemplar to follow in their own lives. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Maoist-Third Worldist Collective. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.